Welcome back. We had an opportunity last time to talk about brain science, and in particular, three brain networks that have to do with attention and that we think, as a strong hypothesis, may have some role to play in mindfulness practice itself. We talked about the central executive network, which is a series of brain nodes, including the prefrontal cortex, that's involved in control of attention, focusing, redirecting, and management of attention. We talked about the salience network, where the insula is a prominent node, and its role in actually detection of prominent or salient stimuli that we might experience. And we talked about the default mode network as a brain network that is tied, broadly speaking, to spontaneous thought and mind wandering. Now, if the project that we have in mind is to understand how these networks may actually be involved during mindfulness practice, how would we go about even studying that? How would we go about even exploring that? Well, the first piece of good news is that we know that there are networks that might have a role to play, as we just talked about. The second is that we can actually bring people into the laboratory, in particular into our brain imaging center, to put them in a scanner, have them comfortably lay down, and then practice specific mindfulness practices. And this has been done. It's been done many times over to figure out what brain networks are active during mindfulness exercise, in particular the mindfulness of breathing exercise. And then we called the Find Your Focus practice, which was one of the first ones that you were asked to do. And this was one of the experiments that I'm thinking about in particular was quite ingenious because it required us being able to know when in the cycle of what happens during a mindfulness practice, the participant was actually mind wandering. And this was work done by Hassenkamp and colleagues. And what they did is they asked people to come in that were practitioners. They knew how to do this practice. They'd done it for many months and in some cases years. And when they were in the scanner, they were asked to engage in the practice. But the one addition was they were handed a little button press. And they were told specifically to press a button every time they noticed that their mind had wandered during the practice, right? And this is a central instruction in the practice. When you notice your mind has wandered, simply return it back to the breath-related sensations. But that button press ended up being a very handy tag in the ongoing brain activity as it was transpiring. The button press allowed the researchers to look to see what brain network was activated just before. And then maybe even just before that, and perhaps even just before that. And what ended up happening is that you could kind of trace the entire trajectory of practice itself, beginning with the instructions to focus, in particular on breath-related sensations. Keep noticing what's going on. Mind wandering may be detected. You become aware that the mind wandering has occurred, and then you go back to redirecting. So the button press to them was an indication that probably they would be noticing that they had mind wandered. And that's when they pressed the button. Just before that, they probably were mind wandering. And prior to that, they were probably on task and paying attention as they should. So the predictions they had going in were that right around when the button was pressed, just prior, the saliency network may be activated. And sure enough, they found that it was. They then predicted that right before that, when mind wandering might be happening before detection of it could occur, the default mode may be active. And it was. And then prior to that, they predicted that participants were probably in that one cycle of practice focusing on breath-related sensations as they should, and the central executive network would be active. And that's also what they ended up finding. So they saw in this experiment people practicing mindfulness in a scanner with a series of different networks activated. When they were focusing, the central executive network was active. When they were actually mind wandering, the default mode network was active. When they became aware that they were mind wandering, the saliency network was activated. This was such a neat experiment to allow us to actually track what was happening as people were practicing in the scanner. And it gave very strong clues of what might be going on if people are practicing for not just a few minutes in the scanner, but maybe for weeks or potentially even months or even years, what might happen to these various networks. So, the first thing to say is that we did have a way forward. We now knew what kinds of networks may be activated, even the sequence over which they may be activated. And there were a lot of other clues from the kinds of studies that I was describing to you earlier, behavioral tasks, where people were doing attention tasks. And we were noticing that their performance was better after having received mindfulness training. So together we could start piecing together what might be going on as a function of mindfulness training. And when I mean mindfulness training here, I mean engaging in a series of practices in sequence over a dedicated period of time. Now, if people are voluntarily choosing to be practitioners, this could be months or years. Or if they're taking a formal manualized course like mindfulness based stress reduction, we know exactly what suite of practices they'll be introduced to and the order in which they'll be introduced to them. And we know what the homework requirements are, about 45 minutes a day for each of the practices for each of the weeks of the 8-week training. So, the kinds of things researchers became very interested in knowing next was what happens if somebody takes a mindfulness training course? Are there changes in the structure and function of these brain networks? And there's something very important to actually understand about brain networks as it relates to functional MRI studies of the brain. The first is that we can actually look at the integrity and functioning of specific networks. And when a particular network is active, other networks are suppressed. It's something called anti-correlated activity. So one goes up, necessarily the activity of other networks goes down. So for example, when you are very focused, the activity within your central executive network would be prominent, and the activity of the default mode network tied to mind wandering would be reduced. But the opposite is true when you're mind wandering. There's going to be more activity in the default mode network during mind wandering episodes than when you are focused. And the activity in the executive networks during mind wandering is dialed down. So one of the questions that we were going to ask, and the field as a whole is starting to get a handle on, is what happens to this kind of mind wandering and mind wandering related activity when people go through a mindfulness training program or when they are long-term practitioners. The default mode was a very handy place to look to see what was going on. And in fact, what we've been able to see in many studies now is that self-reported mind wandering as a function of getting mindfulness training is reduced, meta-awareness is increased, and when we look at the activity of the default mode, we see that it is less active in people that have been mindfulness practitioners. So it gives us a strong indication that perhaps this is tied to the reduction in mind wandering occurring from receiving mindfulness training. Okay. We also have a lot of clues of what might be going on with the other networks, with the executive network and the saliency network. And the story there is that it ends up that there are specific nodes within each of these networks. For example, for the executive network, we can look within certain nodes of the prefrontal cortex to see if their structure looks any different. And in fact, there's evidence that specific regions of the prefrontal cortex look like their structural integrity is stronger, something called cortical thickening, whereas aging thins out the prefrontal cortex, specific regions tend to be thicker and more pronounced. Neurons are more densely packed in parts of the frontal lobes when people are mindfulness practitioners. The same thing is true for aspects of the saliency network, in particular the insula. It looks like there's cortical thickening in some of those nodes of the insula as well. So those were giving us an indication that there are indeed functional changes, a kind of dialing down of default mode activity, structural changes, cortical thickening in specific nodes of attention-related networks, and there are recent studies that suggest the coordination between all of these networks is happening much more fluidly and in a much more beneficial manner than happened before people engaged in mindfulness training. So I hope that this gives you a sense that, when you say mindfulness training is all in your head, it literally is. It is literally changing the structure and function of your brain. And I would say we're just at the beginning stages of understanding the brain science of mindfulness. These are just the beginning clues that what we think are prominent brain networks tied to these practices are actually showing some signs of changing in sensible directions. And I think what will be more exciting in the coming years is when we can actually look with greater precision within individuals to see how individuals who receive training may be altering their own functioning. Right now, we have to aggregate across a lot of people, and we might not even know exactly what your network is for nodes that are prominent in the default mode or saliency network, as well as the central executive network. And some of that exciting work is beginning to happen already. So stay tuned on the brain science, but know for now that yes, it is the case that mindfulness training is showing tractable changes in brain structure and function to appear as if the brain is functioning more healthfully as a function of training. And what I'd like to talk about next time is how this translates into us getting a good prescription of how leaders can actually train the brain in a manner that is feasible for time pressured groups.